world. Welcome to the Casual Historian Podcast. My name is Grant and this is my co-host James.
Hello again, everyone.
This is the podcast where me and my friend talk about things we don't get to talk about in our regular history classes. And today is the beginning of a two-parter because this is a very long subject, but we're going to be talking about the history of political Islam.
Or the political history of Islam.
Yes, that is...
That's a distinction.
Yeah. So it's funny is that when you say sort of like political history of Islam or history of political Islam, like political Islam to me almost just sort of sounds redundant given Islam's history in general. In fact, that there's very little or almost no time in Islam's history where it was not the governing political apparatus for a state.
Yes, that's actually very true. And before we get into this, I do want to just make it clear to our listeners, I almost said viewers for some reason, we're not doing that yet, to our listeners, that this is merely an exploration and a survey of the political apparatus and interactions of the Islamic world, both within itself and with the outside world. I am not trying to make any kind of value judgments or any kind of evaluation or judgments about Islam as a religion. This is merely an examination of the history of Islam in a political dimension. So we're not really going to touch much on doctrine or theology in that respect.
I will clarify that if any of that is brought up, it's not my or James's own thoughts, but rather I'll be bringing up a particular Islamic historian who is, he himself, Muslim. So there will be the perspectives of Islam from the perspective of a modern Muslim. If any of that it does come up, it's from their ideas, not purely our own. So I guess let's start with talking about the history of political Islam up to, say, the fall of Constantinople. That seems to be a big watermark for political Islam, in which it goes from being a constant war with the old Rome to its conflict with the modern Europe.
Well, it's, the fall of Constantinople in 1453 is, a huge watershed and watermark for so many, reasons and areas, it's often used as the defining mark as the end of the Middle Ages, for example. But let's shift back about 800 or more years to the Middle East. At this point, the Middle East is a place in chaos, and I know that that's probably a difficult concept for some people to understand now. The Middle East at this time is a place of political and religious violence, with borders changing constantly, insurgencies raging. It's almost like nothing ever changed. The big geopolitical contest, which was centered in the Middle East at this time, was between the Roman Empire, specifically the East Roman Empire, and the Zoroastrian Persian Empire. Both empires had long-standing rivalries with each other, going back for a few centuries. But this would be the epic showdown that no one had considered ever happening. The Persians had actually conquered and occupied large sections of the Roman Empire, including Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and captured, important Christian relics like relics of the cross and other things. The Romans managed to turn things around and reclaim their territories and push the Persians back, but these wars were hugely destructive and devastating to the infrastructure. Keep in mind that at this time, areas like Syria and Egypt are densely populated, and they have large urban populations that were hugely damaged by the conflict between the Romans and the Persians. And by the same context, Mesopotamia, what's now Iraq, which is under Persian control, also experienced large population shifts. And onto this stage of two exhausted and impoverished world players explodes Islam. The first caliphate, which was established after Muhammad's death, called the Rashidun Caliphate, or the rightly guided caliphate, aimed to expand itself and to spread Islam by acquiring territory. And having already unified the Arabian Peninsula, the only options now were to expand northward and eastward and westward, which meant the first targets were Zoroastrian Persia and the Christian Roman Empire. Zoroastrian Persia was racked in a succession crisis, impoverished by the wars, its people exhausted, and fell very quickly. Attempts to forge an alliance with their erstwhile enemies, the Romans, proved unsuccessful because both sides were completely unprepared to fight another war so quickly and unpreparedly. The new caliphate made rapid advances in gains, and within 100 years, beyond completely extinguishing Zoroastrian Persia as an entity, it also absorbed what's now Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and just kept rolling. It rapidly advanced into Armenia, into Anatolia, they besieged Constantinople and were turned back, as well as launching naval campaigns throughout the Mediterranean that would eventually bring them into North Africa and Spain. And this pretty much sets the context for the next roughly 800 years of interactions between Islam and the rest of the world. Islam is, like Christianity, a religion that has a missionary imperative, and expanding itself politically was, at the time, the most effective way to go about that. The Muslims viewed Zoroastrianism to be basically pagan, and Zoroastrianism was largely extinguished in Persia at the time. Christianity and Judaism were seen as cousin religions, and were given a somewhat protected status as people of the book. But as Islam began to advance, eastward, when it arrives in India, it runs up against Buddhism and Hinduism, and as it moves eastward, even further, it eventually even encounters the Taoism, Confucianism of the Chinese areas. But you look at this and you see you have this powerhouse empire that explodes onto the scene. It conquered more territory in a rapid manner and actually held onto it than any empire had previously. You had, for example, Alexander's conquests, which were rapid, but that fell apart very quickly. The fact that the first Islamic empire under the Rashidun Caliphate and then the Abbasids under the Umayyads lasted so long and maintained its territorial integrity is very impressive. It's a feat that even Rome didn't achieve.
One of the things I think you could sort of attribute to this rapid expansion is more along the lines of the early history of both religions. The fact of the matter is, Islam did not spend very long time as the minority religion or as an oppressed religion. Within the lifetime of Muhammad, they had established themselves as a state, first out of Medina, and then it expanded into Mecca, and then across the Arabian Peninsula. While Christianity, on the other hand, spent 300 years as a oppressed religion within the Roman Empire. So I think you sort of find this different relation between the state and Christianity than you do with the state and Islam.
Well, yes. It's important to note that even by this point, Christianity has begun to attribute religious connotations to the Roman emperors, for example. But there was not the blending of religious and secular power in quite the same way that the Islamic political structure in the Caliphate did, because the Caliph, as a commander of the faithful, is both a political and a religious figure. And one of the other key differences in that respect is that whereas in the Christian world, there is a separate political and a separate religious hierarchy. Islam doesn't have a hierarchy in the way that we understand it in Christianity. Like there are no parallels for a patriarch or a pope or for bishops and such. Local leaders are generally more autonomous. There is no single cleric in Islam that can create an order that is mandatory for all the faithful to follow, even under the Caliphate. The Caliph is a close thing to it because he wields both political and religious power by virtue of holding the same office.
Well, I would actually give an exception to that, in which the majority of Muslims in the world, between 80 and 90%, depending on who exactly you cite or who you're asking, would be Sunni Muslims. And Sunni Muslim is a very divided form of Islam. I like to compare it to sort of Protestantism in that there's so many different denominations and sects of it that it's really hard to put it all into a single basket, but we're sort of forced to when talking about it because there are so many. But when you're saying that there's nothing similar to, say, a patriarch, there actually would be in Shia Islam. Shia Islam actually has a lot in common with Eastern Orthodoxy, but instead of, patriarchs, they have ayatollahs. The ayatollahs, and there's more than one. We in the United States tend to think of just one ayatollah, that being one in Iran. But in reality, there are multiple ayatollahs across the Islamic world, and different Shia Muslim communities, different Shia Muslim denominations and groups, each decide to look towards one of the ayatollahs as their sort of interpreting religious figure on their own. So yes, there is no extreme hierarchy, but they do have something like that, which is sort of the similarities between Greek Orthodoxy and at least 12er Shia Islam.
I think I do think that's a bit of a stretch of a comparison. But again, even this is just more of a look at the fact that in Islam, especially during the days of the Caliphate, no caliph is really bound by has any political necessity to really be beholden to a religious hierarchy. In Rome, both in the East and West, emperors can be undone by opposition from the bishops, and we see it happen repeatedly in both the Byzantine and the Holy Roman Empires, that if the religious hierarchy is not with you, it can make your political legitimacy extremely rocky. But pressing on in a political sense, we arrive, at the development of the Umayyad Caliphate, which is called a golden age for Islam. This is where we really started to see a flowering of civilization in the Middle East that had never been seen before. The Umayyads were very smart in that what they did was they seized upon the varying cultures of the area and synthesize them together. So you have, for example, the court structure and much of the political structure mirrors that of the old Persian Empire. In fact, even the script that Arabic uses is called a Persianate script. Then you also have the reintroduction or reappearance in the area of philosophy and interest in the sciences. Engineering as well is definitely built on East Roman arches and domes. You have this general flowering and synthesis of culture that will actually spread throughout the caliphate, and will actually, interestingly enough, backdoor the end of the Dark Ages, because in Western Europe, of course, when the political authority collapsed and the Great Migrations completely shifted entire communities, civilization was barely flickering like an ember in a dying fire. The conquest of Spain brought back a sense of scholasticism and revived interest in Aristotle, which had all but disappeared in Western Europe. And then you get figures like eventually Thomas Aquinas, reintroducing Aristotle in a philosophical and theological dimension via what's called Thomism. But by this point, though, it's important to note that the caliphates don't have the succession mechanisms that we tend to think of. Most Western succession systems and monarchies are hereditary. Be it, with agnatic or cognatic, whether it's usually some form of primogeniture, where, the oldest child succeeds, and if not, there are mechanisms for how that's decided. Islam tended to use, not merely for political power, but for other areas as well, a seniority succession, in which case the oldest living member of the family succeeds, regardless of whether or not they're directly descended from the previous ruler. This would eventually create issues by the fact that the Umayyad Caliphate, which once ruled over the entirety of the Islamic world, would be split off and be linked solely to the territories in Spain, versus the Abbasid Caliphate, which would take pretty much everything else. But this would continue to gradually break down as smaller successor states would break off here and there, but still there was only ever one caliph, headquartered by this point in Baghdad.
Yes. In my study of Islamic history in general, especially political Islam, I like to point out to one of my favorite authors would be Tamim Ansari, in particular his book Destiny Disrupted. He is a Muslim historian from Afghanistan, educated in the West, but basically he talks about with the early Muslim empires, it's that a lot of historians today, especially in our more politically correct intellectual atmospheres, that they like to emphasize how progressive the early Islamic empires were. And in a way, that's very correct. They had, for a while, they did have, more progressive policies for, say, women and non-Muslims in their empires. But as Tamain Ansari points out, is that at about the 11th or 12th century, between those times, social, political, and scientific progress in the Islamic world just sort of stopped. And there's no complete answer as to why. It's sort of, some people have tried blaming individual things, like some people have tried blaming the Crusades as halting Islamic progress. Others have tried blaming the Mongol invasions. But none of those by themselves seem to be enough to explain why social and scientific progress just sort of stopped out of nowhere between the 11th and 12th centuries.
Well, actually, on their own, the Crusades and on their own, the Mongol invasions may not be enough to explain that, but taken together, as well as with the continuous political fragmentation of the Islamic world, you can actually look at it that way, which does bring us to the Crusades. The Crusades are, of course, one of the most hugely controversial topics in both Christian and Muslim history, and we still feel a kind of psychological effect of it down to this day. It's important to note that the First Crusade that was called was in response to basically a distress call from the Byzantine emperor, who was, by this point, by the early 11th century, the Byzantines have been fighting a continuous war with Islam, making some progress, losing progress, back and forth. But eventually, the Byzantine emperor sends out a call for help to reclaim the Byzantine territories that were once in Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. The Western world, by this point, has become feudal. It's just as politically fragmented, if not more so, than Islam. And because of the feudal system, there's a lot of violence constantly. And the popes have actually realized that they, despite their pretensions to wielding political or temporal authority, doesn't always quite come off. So Pope Urban calls the crusade, in which he basically says, sins of those who go will be forgiven, blessings, etc. Go liberate the holy city. And that's where we get the political dimension, the religious dimension of the Crusades from. It's important to note, though, that by this point, this is not the first or only time that there is a political conflict between Islamic and Christian states. By this point, even now, in the Iberian Peninsula, the Christian states of northern Spain are trying to claw back bit by bit the beginnings of the Reconquista in Spain, which will have its own messy ending later on. Then you have, at the same time, the Byzantine struggle, as we've mentioned, in the East. The Crusades, though, are a traumatic moment for both sides, because the eventual failure of the Crusades does create crises of confidence in Western Christendom, in which their ultimate failure means that there is a question of do we actually have the mandate to do this, or why did God not support us? Which results in some weird excursions, such as the Northern Crusades later on, to Christianize the Balts. But the effects of the Crusades on the region were significant. It created a permanent political wedge between the West and the Byzantines, because the Byzantines considered the Crusaders to have broken their promises. The promise was that the territory would be handed back to the emperor. They formed their own territories. The violence of the Crusaders in these areas against both non-Western Christians, Muslims, and Jews created a widespread chaos and demographic shifts. And by the time Islam began to respond, the political wing of Islam began to reunify Syria and Egypt together. The Crusader states were in no position to respond. But the legacy of the Crusades was one of unmitigated violence. It was one that smacked of religious zealotry, and was one that was marked by incompetent leadership and rulership in the Crusader states. So the Crusades were not, on balance, a success for anybody. But it also sets up, eventually, the nightmare that would be the Mongols. And the Mongols would be a nightmare for everyone.
Though, it's funny is that the Islamic world and Christendom never united to fight the Mongols. And I've heard some sources claiming that there are even those in the Islamic world who offered alliance with the Christians, even some of them offering to, you know what, we'll convert if you help us fight the Mongols. I can't corroborate whether or not that source is legitimate, but it seems like something the Muslims were exposed to the Mongols first. So it seems like something that some of them, depending on how desperate they felt, may have felt necessity to offer up something like that, but it's something I can substantiate here.
We can verify that there were truces and alliances. Some of the surviving Crusader states in the Middle East and Upper Syria did support or ally with Muslim territories to try to resist the Mongols. In the Caucasus, Georgians, Armenians made common cause with Islamic Azeris to try to repel the Mongols. The Mongols, the apex of the Mongol attacks on the Islamic world, which would be a great trauma, I would say, as well as a great loss to civilization in general, was the sack of Baghdad by the Mongols, in which one of the great casualties was Baghdad's great library, or the House of Wisdom. Contemporary chroniclers describe the Mongols throwing manuscripts into the Tigris River, which they described as running black with ink from the manuscripts as they dissolved.
Yeah. Something I want to sort of touch on a little bit was both the Islamic world and Christendom's sort of intellectual response to the Crusades, and notice that for Christian Europe, they had a much stronger sort of internal reaction to the Crusades, as in, is this what Christians are supposed to be doing? Because Christianity doesn't have a formal doctrinal idea of holy war. Now, I don't want to get too bogged down in religious doctrine, but the fact of the matter is, Islam does have a doctrine that supports this. And it's not, and yes, it's kind of politically incorrect to point out that jihad can mean holy war. Yes, it also means struggle. But the first Islamic ruler to use the concept of jihad to mean holy war was the second caliph, Omar. So it's something that's in there. I don't want to get too much further into that, but I noticed that I think in the Islamic world there was sort of a less internal visceral reaction to the Crusades, as in, is this against our religion, as there was in Europe.
Well, in Europe, however, Christianity had struggled with the concept of war from the time they began to become the dominant religion of the Roman Empire. And there was the notion of the just war, which was a war that was almost always defensive in nature, which if you look at the Byzantine wars against both the Persians and against later on the Caliphate, it was always a defensive action, with offensives being mainly aimed at reclaiming territory. In the West, it was a similar situation with the Spanish kingdoms trying to reclaim territory, but even that was a bit more questionable, mostly because the kingdoms of northern Spain, Galicia, Asturias, Navarra, had never actually ruled the larger part of the peninsula. It was the Visigothic kingdom that was there beforehand, and they weren't successors of it. But whereas the religious dimension to war may have been a question in theoretical circles in the West, it certainly wasn't by any point a matter of reluctance for the Christian West to participate in the Crusades, because the history of Western Christendom bears out that they had no problems going to war with each other on a regular basis.
Yes, though they didn't have the same kind of religious justification that you could find in Islam. You can also find plenty of justification for peace, but there is more, at least contextual justification within Islam. But we don't want to get bogged down.
Yeah,
in this.
and again, I'll point out that when Pope Urban proclaimed the Crusade, as well as other notable figures that preach it, like Bernard of Clairvaux, there were unprecedented references to it being a holy war. If you look at the Byzantine request is a political one. It's help us reclaim territory to stabilize our frontiers. In the West, it takes on a religious connotation almost immediately. The idea, to say we have to open paths for pilgrims. Let those who fight and die in the Crusades are guaranteed salvation, which is similar to rhetoric we find in Islam contemporarily. So it's the religion is something that can either, depending on how you look at it, either co-opt politics for its own ends or is co-opted by politics for its own ends. There are arguments made on the other side of that. But moving on, back to the Mongols.
Yes.
Eventually, the Mongols actually do decide to adopt Islam as religion. Previously, they were a variant of paganism found in Central Asia. Then they adopt Islam. But even then, Mongolian Islam takes on a distinctive characteristic from Islam in the core of the Islamic world, in the Middle East, North Africa, the Iranian Plateau. Probably because the Mongols do adopt Islam as a religion, they don't adopt Islamic or the Islamic world's civilizational structures. But the Mongols will then become the next big confrontation for Eastern Europe in a religious struggle. Mongols will launch an attack on Kiev and Rus, which will submerge permanently. Kiev will never be a relevant capital until the late 20th century. As a result of this, the Mongols will also engage in struggles with the Poles and with the Hungarians. The 13th century is very interesting that it's, by this point, the civilizational flowering has somewhat stalled within the Islamic world. The West is in the midst, still in the midst of its, is coming out of the Dark Ages, but still in the Middle Ages and still not making progress. But this actually, the 13th century kind of marks the high watermark, the first high watermark of Islamic advances into Europe. The majority of Spain is still under the control of the Caliphate of Al-Andalus. The Russian principalities are subjugated by the Mongols, as are the Georgian and Armenian principalities in the Caucasus. And by this point, the Seljuk Turks have arrived and driven the Byzantines out of even most of Anatolia. By this point, the West begins to perceive the threat from the Islamic world as less a religious one, in that it's not about a conflict of religious faiths, that it's almost an existential one, that there's a need to repel the invasions and try to stabilize the frontiers. However, the West is too politically disunited in itself to be able to set these issues aside. You have, these rivalries between the French and the English kings. You have rivalries among the Italian city-states. The questions of the rivalry between the Pope and the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. But there's no political cohesion in the West that's able to make a response. The Byzantines are too weak to respond. And the opportunities this perfect storm will create will allow a initially minor Turkish dynasty, the Ottomans, to begin to develop and unify the Turkic tribes in Anatolia.
Yes, and from this point, I guess we get to nearing the end of this particular one, where we get to the 15th century, which sort of, I think, for this Eurasian area, Europe, Near East, we get the two major quasi-religious, or one very religious, one quasi-religious as well, climactic events. The fall of Constantinople, and it sort of seems like I'm not sure what word to use, a certain je ne sais quoi, pardon my terrible use of French for the only word I can use, but fall of Constantinople, followed by a few decades later, the Protestant Reformation, a huge religious and political shakeups on both sides of the European peninsula, all occurring within decades of each other.
Yeah, well, it's Constantinople's fall in 1453 is foreshadowed about 250 years earlier during the Fourth Crusade, in which Constantinople was sacked by Italian and Frankish crusaders, who then set up their own, puppet crusader states, as they were wont to do, just like they did after the First Crusade. This would actually critically weaken the Byzantine bulwark against the Turks, because for a long time, by this point, the Byzantines are pretty much the defenders of Eastern Europe. They are what are holding the Turks back, in much the same way that later on the Venetians will have to be. But by then, the frontiers moved considerably to the west. The Byzantine reunification and attempts to survive for the next 100 years are almost epic and almost poetic in how tragic they are, because by this point the empire's decline is so terminal, they've been so weakened, and the West has no interest in trying to support them, that bit by bit their territories are whittled away. And by the early 1400s, the Ottomans have actually arrived in Europe proper. The city of Constantinople is pretty much cut off from any of its other possessions, and the Bulgarians and Serbians are now being subjugated by the Turks. In the early 1400s as well, the last actual crusade will be called, which was called the Crusade of Varna, in which a coalition of Hungarian, Polish, and other armies would attempt to attack the Ottomans to try to, cut them off from completely encircling Constantinople, which met in defeat, and would plunge Eastern Europe itself into chaos for a while by virtue of the fact that the king of Hungary and Poland was killed without an heir, which created dynastic ripples throughout Poland, Lithuania, Hungary, and Bohemia. And also left the Byzantines out to dry. So by this point, the West has realized that Constantinople is in actual danger of falling. Even though it was Christian forces who captured and sacked Constantinople in 1204, Constantinople has this kind of legend about it that it's virtually impregnable. And that even though it's now in the hands of different kinds of Christians, because we're now 4 centuries past the Great Schism, the idea is that it's a center of the Christian world. Even the Turks, the Ottomans called it the city of the world's desire, as a city of wealth and riches and culture. By now, it's actually depopulated and war torn, but it carries an immense psychological significance for any side in this. So in 1453. When Constantinople is taken by the Turks and the last Byzantine emperor, in some ways the last Roman emperor, is killed defending the city, it's a major shockwave to the entirety of civilization at the time. In the Christian world, both Orthodox and Catholic, it's a trauma. It brings home a reality that the Byzantines aren't there anymore to be the bulwark they were. And it provokes panic. There's widespread lamentations. Chroniclers would write spurious things about celestial signs being shown, like that there were eclipses or meteors marking the fall of Constantinople. It would be such a trauma that in hymns in Iceland after the Reformation, supplications are made to save us, for God to save us from the Turks. Meanwhile, on the Turkish side of things, it brings a new dimension politically to the Caliphate, because by this point, the capture of Constantinople, which had been a dream, an attempt by successive caliphs from the Rashidun to the Umayyads to the Abbasids, that never materialized, never succeeded. It was the House of Ottoman that succeeded. And so it cemented this sense of dominion over the Islamic world as a claim that would be made, and indeed not only that, but also that the Ottomans would set themselves up within their own territories as a kind of successor to the empire, the Roman Empire.
Yeah. there's, I guess, with the fall of Constantinople, there's something of a tragic silver lining to it. It's that the Renaissance was largely brought about because old ideas from the Greek East were finally brought to the West, and the collapse of the Byzantine Empire resulted in a lot of scholars and a lot of educated people in the East, in the Byzantine East, going to the West, for the places where they feel they'd have religious and political safety. And so I guess that's sort of the tragic silver lining to the fall of Constantinople, is that it resulted in what was first the intellectual reemergence of the West, and then that intellectual reemergence eventually turned into economic and political and military reemergence onto the world stage, which is just, depending on who you ask, just waning today.
Well, when you look at the fall of Constantinople, and we touched on this at the beginning of this episode, it's a huge watershed, because the fall of Constantinople is not merely, this convenient means of saying, okay, here's the end of the Middle Ages. It actually stretches bigger than that. The fall of Constantinople marks the end of the Roman Empire, the end of an unbroken succession of a Roman Empire. Though its legacy would be carried on to an extent in Russia, in the West by the Roman Empire, that its intellectual successors would begin the Italian Renaissance, but the religious dimension would be carried on in Russia. But the thing is that also, this would spark a new development and growth of civilization in the Islamic world as well, because now it's not Damascus, it's not Baghdad, because now it's not Damascus or Baghdad that are the centers of the Islamic world. It's now Constantinople, and Constantinople becomes a cosmopolitan city once again, with a flowering court and a culture, and will retain its great status as a trade city. And for the duration of most of the Ottoman rulership of it, is a diverse city in which Italians trade there, Greeks, Armenians, and Bulgars live there, and you see this flowering of an Islamic Renaissance in art, in architecture, and poetry that you didn't see for most of the last 200 years. But it also brings home the idea that for the first time, the opponents of the caliphate of the day are not to be found in the Orthodox world any longer. They are now going to be found in the states of Central and Western Europe, which will set the stage for the great struggles of the 15th, 16th, even down to the 19th centuries, which, and we'll cover those in, I believe, next week.
All right, then. This has been the Casual Historian Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, then give us a rating and a review on iTunes. You can also find this podcast on the Casual Historian YouTube channel. And you can follow the Casual Historian on Facebook and Twitter. And go to casualhistorian.com for more content like this. You can email any comments, questions, or business inquiries to casualhistorian@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.